Right, we are going to reconvene our meeting and continue to hear from Legislative Council. We now have Legislative Council Maria Royal.
Great. It's nice to be here and see you all. So I'm going to be doing a presentation on broadband. There's a lot of information. I tried to condense it as much as possible so that you have an overview of what some of the major issues are in the state, things that the state has done in the past, and issues that continue to emerge that you'll no doubt be grappling with going forward. So I don't know if you like to work from hard copies or just follow online, but there are plenty of copies for everybody. And then there's an extra one. Kate, I don't know if you want a hard copy as well.
Is this on our committee page at this
It
point?
should be, I believe it's posted.
I can't get a link.
It is posted.
It is?
I just got it to open.
You got it to open?
Maybe it just
Oh my
wasn't.
God.
Yeah, refresh.
I did.
Oh, great. So Kate's going to be advancing the slides for me, which is terrific. So I can just work from my hard copy as well.
Yeah.
So if you turn to the table of contents, I'm going to quickly just go over what I'm hoping to cover by today so that you will feel very conversant in the area of broadband. So first, talking about what is broadband, what is the definition? There are lots of consequences to whether a service actually meets this threshold of broadband, which we'll talk about. We're going to briefly review, although all of you are familiar with broadband, you access the internet, but we'll go over just kind of the basics of the technology, the different types of means of connecting to the internet. We'll talk very generally at a high level about network architecture. So when you're deploying broadband, what are you actually building? And what are the different components of a network? Then we're going to talk about universal connectivity in Vermont. You do have a statutory goal for achieving universal connectivity. We'll talk about what that goal is. And I'll also mention some of the updated statistics about where you are in meeting that goal. We will, and then also talk about the challenges to achieving universal broadband. We'll review kind of the major players, state actors, who's involved primarily with broadband issues. Significantly, we'll talk about the Vermont Community Broadband Board, which is really the entity you've created to solve and bring broadband to those very difficult, expensive, hard to reach places. But we'll talk more specifically about that entity. And we'll also talk about communications union districts. Is this all sounding kind of familiar? Like you read the paper, so you kind of know. But so please tell me to hurry up if this is getting just a little bit too bogged down in detail.
Hurry up, please.
Okay. We can wrap it up right there. So read it on your own. So, and then we'll go over the federal actors, the main federal entities that have authority over broadband programs, the regulatory landscape, how that affects what the state can and cannot do. We'll talk very briefly about some of the initiatives that have been promoted or tried in the state, and then kind of where you are today. And then we'll end with some of the emerging issues that you'll no doubt think about by the end of the session. So that's a lot. And we'll just go through, and please interrupt me at any point if you have questions. And also, seriously, if I'm going too slow and you want to just move along, that's fine too. So let's just quickly review, what is broadband? Basically, one of the definitions, there are many definitions that have varying degrees of technical descriptions, but basically it's the transmission of wide bandwidth data over a high-speed internet connection. So what isn't broadband? Some of you will remember back in the day, dial-up service, right? I certainly remember that, where you used the copper telephone line, you placed a telephone call. You called a server to get connected to the internet. That was not considered high speed, did not have large amounts of data traveling over that connection. And the other distinguishing feature was it wasn't always on. So when we talk about broadband today, we talk about a service that's always on. And by that, I mean, you had to make a telephone call. You couldn't make a voice call and call the server. You could only use one service at a time. So when you hung up the phone, you ended your broadband connectivity. When we talk about you ended your internet connectivity, excuse me. When we talk about broadband today, we talk about a service that's always on, whether it's a DSL, through cable, wireless, whatever. And then in terms of, well, what is high-speed internet connection? The important thing to know there is the FCC, which is the Federal Communications Commission, defines what is considered the minimum speed to constitute high-speed broadband. And they do that because they have guidelines that say, what is the minimum service you need to basically access the applications that are in use today? So it evolves. That standard, those speed requirements evolve over time as the technology changes and as our use of the internet changes, right? Obviously, particularly with the pandemic, I think it was highlighted the many applications and uses of broadband. So the FCC sets a definition, and so right now the definition set by the FCC is what's called 25.3. Is that a familiar, you all look at your phone, you look at your data connections, and you're familiar with the speeds generally that you get, right? So just quickly, what does it mean? What does 25.3 mean? You measure the transmission of data in megabits per second. You can actually measure it in gigabits or kilobits, but the 25.3 speed is in megabits per second. 25 megabits per second is the download speed. So that's your ability to receive information. The 3 megabits per second, which is a lower threshold, refers to your ability to upload information. So if you want to do video conferencing, if you want to upload photographs, that would be your upload. So why is that threshold? So in order for a provider to say they offer high-speed internet, it has to be at least 25.3 service. That's also really important because a lot of the federal broadband programs are premised upon whether or not an address has access to 25.3. And that, if they don't, that can have repercussions for how much funding is available under federal programs. So that's why I wanted to just talk about that FCC definition, and we'll talk about it later on in the presentation. Often broadband, high-speed internet, the terms are used interchangeably, and I'm going to do that. I'll talk about broadband, high-speed internet. Mostly I'll just refer to broadband. So really quickly, because I'm sure you're probably familiar with the broadband technologies, we often categorize them into wired service or wireless service. So wired, you think of the early examples, the phone companies, when they stopped off or when they moved beyond dial-up, they were offering DSL service, right? Using the traditional copper telephone line to access the internet. Then the cable industry, using the cable television infrastructure, was able to offer access to the internet through cable modem service. Then what became more readily available is fiber optic. And that's really the gold standard at this point in time for accessing the internet. It makes available the fastest connections, both in terms of download and upload. And yep, go ahead.
Representative Pat.
I'm just curious why on the wired section DSL is there, because that's what I have, and no one. That's what's provided by the phone company, not by making a phone call, but no one I know that has DSL has anywhere near 25.3.
Excellent question.
Okay.
Thank you for letting me clarify. So I wasn't necessarily saying that they meet the definition of broadband, but they are a means of connecting to the internet.
Okay.
Now, that is also a very good question because I know there are different types of DSL and I know where you're located, how far the signal has to travel. So my understanding is some people have access to 25.3 on DSL. At least that was what has been said. Whether or not that is
No one in
capable,
my
that's a
district.
great question for the providers.
Okay.
You can also have hybrid networks, right? So a lot of the cable companies who use traditional coaxial cable are also building out their networks with fiber. The further they can build out the fiber network, the faster the speeds at the end users, right? And then just briefly in terms of wireless service, we think of that in terms of, I'll start with mobile, which I have last. So most people have a smartphone. You take it with you, it connects to the cell towers, it's a mobile device. Some locations in Vermont, some regions, they receive their service wirelessly through WISP, wireless internet service providers, WISPs. The big distinction for fixed service, not mobile, the big distinction in the wireless world is between terrestrial service. So you might get service from a cell tower, microcells that are put up in your region, your area, or you may have service from satellite providers. Traditionally, and the earlier forms of satellite were provided from what are called geostationary, basically satellites that are at a very high orbit. So if you can imagine like a flashlight shining down on the Earth that's very far away, it covers a really broad range. So a lot of very rural areas were able to get some service, but that light is diffuse, right? If it's so far away. With companies like Starlink and advances in satellite technology, there are now satellites that are called low Earth orbit satellite. They're much closer to the Earth. So if that flashlight came closer, it would cover a smaller region, but the capability of sending information is much better. So that's one of the newer technologies. I think you're all probably familiar with Starlink and aware of some of the issues, all of the satellites that are being launched into orbit. So that was a quick review of the connectivity options. And then the next slide, I just wanted to talk very briefly, really to highlight some terms about network architecture. And I apologize because my little picture that I stole from a federal website, you'll see linked there in red. This is a graphic from the NTIA's Broadband USA office. And I linked it not only so you could look more closely at the picture, but they have great information on technologies and infrastructure, much more in depth than what I'm providing. But if you want to understand a little bit better from kind of a more technical engineering side of things. But what I mostly wanted to talk about, when you're building a network, a lot of what the state has done is fund solutions in what's called the last mile of the network. Those are the connections to the houses and businesses, right? Those are the most expensive, generally, most expensive locations to build. So a lot of the grant programs have to do with building to the last mile, which is not to say there hasn't been funding. And this is certainly true now because there's a lot of federal funding available for middle mile. Middle mile doesn't go to a home, doesn't go to an end user, but there are larger kind of transmission lines that maybe connect a town with another town. So it might run along a state highway or interstate, but it's not going to a home or business, but it has greater capacity to move. If you think of it like in the electric industry, like the transmission lines, right? You have the distribution lines that go to the houses. You have the major high voltage transmission lines. Middle mile fiber is kind of the equivalent of transmission. And then beyond that, the largest component that travel the greatest distance is called the backbone or the core, the internet core. So these are the cables that run along the ocean floor connecting continents, right? So most of the state's attention has been on the last mile, and we will talk about some other middle mile funding opportunities that may present themselves to you. So I mentioned that the state does have a goal of achieving universal connectivity, and that goal is in statute. And I've basically pretty much put it in here in bold word for word. And so that goal is by the end of 2024, so in about 2 years, every E911 business and residential location in Vermont has access to broadband capable of at least 100/100. So right now that's fiber. So that's your goal. And that's been the goal, I think, for about 10 years. I think in 2014, you set that goal.
Not the 100.
Correct.
100 was 79, Act 79.
It's when you moved it to 100. I think you're right. Thank you, Representative Sevilla. Yes. Yes, that's a great, let me go back and make sure I get that right.
I think we had mishmash speeds. in
Yes,
different places.
yes.
I think
I
you clean that up.
Okay. So just in terms of a snapshot of where are we in terms of making progress towards achieving that goal. So there are, and this is information I took from the Department of Public Service website. We'll talk a little bit more about what the department does. But one of the things is they collect data. So according to the data that they have, there are about 313,000 locations in Vermont. 18.6% of the addresses, approximately 58,000 locations, do not have access to 25.3. For one of them.
That's me.
Almost 70% of the addresses do not have access to 100/100, so the state's goal. You can follow this link and get that information, as well as get all of the maps that they prepare showing where services are, what locations have service, and at what speeds. A lot of really helpful information there. What I didn't include here, but I thought about including, but I didn't know the right number, is an estimate of the cost right now. You will absolutely hear from Christine on Thursday. I will talk about some of the investments you've made recently towards achieving this goal, but she'll have the most recent figures. So again, I think you know this, and I touched upon it briefly already. You know, the challenges, why doesn't everybody have broadband? The biggest one is just the cost. It's expensive to build a network. It's not particularly profitable to put in fiber to a house that's 3 miles up the road, and there's only one house. If I'm a private company, I'm not likely to see a return on my investment. So there isn't an incentive for private companies that are in the business of making a profit to build out to those high cost areas. So it's expensive to build. And because of that, that's one factor, but for many people, the service itself, actually buying a subscription, might not be affordable, presents challenges. And the state has and does offer a subsidy. Actually, the state subsidy may have expired. The FCC has a broadband subsidy that Vermonters can take advantage of.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier that cable or fiber optic is the best route right now.
Right now, I believe that's considered kind of the gold standard of connectivity.
Why wouldn't satellite be so much easier and more efficient than having to string, like you just mentioned, 3, 4, or 5 miles of lines.
Well, for some areas it is definitely more efficient. So you might not get the 100 service. You may get perfectly adequate service. So some areas have explored and actually built wireless infrastructure for that very reason. And certainly people like Elon Musk are investing a lot of money, you know, with the expectation that that technology will continue to improve, and maybe in the long run will be more cost effective to achieve the 100 service or whatever the future speeds requirements are. So you're right, in terms of reaching rural areas, most areas in the state have access to satellite service through HughesNet or other companies. Might not be 100, but you have access to something. There are other costs and other speed issues related to performance, like latency and, you know, things. So it's really just, what service do you want to invest in? What should people have access to? But you're 100% right that a wireless network for many areas, given the topography of Vermont and the lack of density, it does make economic sense.
Thank you.
Representative Pat.
I just want to add the distinction between I forget the terminology, the high level and the low, close to Earth satellites is very critical, because in the case of Starlink, because of the hilly terrain in Vermont, it does not reach it just in the same town. It will reach certain areas and not other areas, simply because of the topography in Vermont.
Representative Sibilia.
Just very briefly, I will say that the two really big pieces of broadband legislation that we have put in place in the last 6 years, and in particular, the last one, Act 71, were centered on two key ideas. One was universality, meaning everyone. So wireless, satellite, fixed wireless does not get to everyone. And then accountability, which is, can we make you go somewhere? Can we hold you accountable if you say you're providing service and you don't? So those were the two key aspects of the broadband policy work that we have done of late.
So then, just another challenge, lack of digital literacy. Some people might not know how to use the internet or have the skills to access it. And then I put here regulatory impediments. I'm going to talk about the FCC. I'm going to talk about the Federal Communications Act, how that act is interpreted and what the states can and can't do. There's a lot of gray areas, whether you think there are impediments or whether you think the system as it's functioning now under the regulatory scheme is working just fine. Very contentious issue, which I'm not going to weigh in on, but I do want to kind of present to you that there are some challenges depending on what you might want to do as a state in terms of your authority. So just becoming familiar with kind of the major players in Vermont, in this state, obviously the internet service providers. We talked about the technology, but so we're really talking about all of the telephone companies, the cable providers, cable television, and then the wireless providers. And then significantly, as Representative Sibilia mentioned, communications union districts. I am going to talk about them a little bit more in the next slide because they are central. The state has made a decision to really support their efforts. So I'll talk a little bit more about what a CUD is in the next slide, but I just wanted to, this is big picture on this page. In terms of the Department of Public Service, they do all the mapping. That's the site that I referenced before, where you can go and see where you have service at what speeds. Vermont has a reputation of having really excellent data, really great maps. I'm going to compare that with what's happening at the federal level, because there is an initiative to have a national broadband map which is really important. And it's raised a lot of issues because of some of the inaccuracies on that map. But Vermont actually on its own has been working very hard to collect as much data as possible to really gain a better understanding on where the locations are that need service. The department also does telecom planning or broadband planning every 3 years. I think the last one I have to check, maybe was in 2021. The department does kind of a 10-year telecom plan, looks out ahead to see what the technologies are, what the needs are, where it's going, and comes up with a plan that will inform various state policy. So this is all through the department. I'm guessing it's a little bit too much in the weeds to talk about, so I'm just going to put it here so you know this is where it is. The Vermont Universal Service Fund. You probably all have noticed on your phone bills, there's a fee, there's a federal fee, universal service charge, and there's a state fee. This refers to the state fee. It's a 2.4% fee on your monthly telephone bill. And that money goes into the Vermont Universal Service Fund and funds various state programs, including 911, which I'm going to talk about at the end because there's an issue there about that money, that fund, that revenue source being able to pay for all of the programs that you've asked it to pay for. So then the Public Utility Commission, this is a quasi-judicial entity. You're probably familiar with the commission in terms of utility regulation. With respect to broadband, where it really has a central role is has rulemaking authority. It uses that authority. One instance in particular that's been very important in terms of broadband deployment, and that has to do with pole attachments. So this is between companies, right? So this is not the consumer trying to connect to the internet, but it regulates how companies, pole owners, usually an electric company that owns the utility pole, and a provider that wants to attach their equipment, whether it's a wire or an antenna to that pole. There's a rule 3.7, that describes that process, the timelines, the formula for the charges. So that's a very important rule to be familiar with because of how it can impact the speed of deployment, for example. They also oversee cable line extensions. So as you know, cable companies are franchised by the PUC in the state. The PUC has authority to allow for cable companies to build out extensions. When they get their franchise, they're required to build out a certain number of lines in their area. If they want to build out additional lines, the PUC has authority to say, we'll let you do that, but you need to provide broadband. So there's a whole cable line extension framework that the PUC oversees. And then the other issue that I wanted to highlight is this has to do with telecom siting. It's called 248A. That refers to a statutory section number. This is a process. Actually, Ellen covers land use issues. So this is something that's more within her area, but if she didn't talk about it earlier, I'm going to highlight it now. You probably don't mind hearing it one more time if you're not familiar with it already. This is a process, I think it was created in 2007 initially. It was intended to speed up, make it a little bit more efficient for companies to build like cell towers in the state. And do that at a state level, a centralized state level, as opposed to going through the Act 250 permitting process and the local ordinances at a local level, which is not to say there isn't input from the municipalities and deference given to their ordinances and plans. The PUC oversees that process. And as I mentioned on the last page, that statute is due to sunset this July. So that will be something you'll think about whether or not you want to let it sunset or extend it in another period of time.
Representative Sibilia.
So perhaps Maria would have additional information, but it has been my perspective, the last two times that we have reauthorized this, why wouldn't we just keep Act 248A? Why wouldn't we just make it permanent? Going back to that accountability measure, like there's very few areas of accountability for the telecommunications companies.
Mm.
So citing is one place where we can just continue to do check-ins. I know that we've done a terrific job regulating it in that aspect, but it is a place where we can have a conversation with telecommunications companies.
I just want to, just for everyone's information, I am one of the two sponsors of a bill that's being drafted that would add some additional responsibilities, particularly on the front end of the communication process when a developer is in a community and wants to put up a tower. That's been very controversial around the state, including in the town I live in. So you'll be seeing that eventually. So.
And so the fourth quadrant to the lower left, I wanted to catch all, and then I realized everybody's involved with broadband. And so, I wanted to just call out municipalities, other than CEDs, they can finance their own broadband projects. They're also involved in the management of rights of way. They're involved in siting issues. The utilities, as I just mentioned, access to their poles. In particular, the Attorney General's office, right now, one of the things that they do related to broadband is they look at network performance of providers. And that's something that Vermont asked that office to do when it passed a net neutrality bill a few years ago. And that net neutrality requirement, are you all familiar with what net neutrality is?
I think you should remind us.
Okay, so basically net neutrality has to do with the ability to access the internet without being blocked or throttled by your internet service provider, right? They can't limit what sites you go to. They can't slow down sites. Why would they do that? Well, they might want to slow down particular sites that maybe compete with their other subsidiaries that offer similar sites, right? So the idea was keep broadband access as open and as unhindered as possible to the general public. This is an issue. We could spend a long time talking about the history of net neutrality. And the reason why is because under the Communications Act, which is, we will talk about that briefly, it's the major federal law that governs communications. There's been a lot of litigation over the authority of the FCC to regulate broadband. Ultimately, I think it was in 2015, under the Obama administration, the FCC came up with a new approach for regulating the internet. And I feel like I'm going to get so far into the technical weeds that it's going to become meaningless. But basically, in how they classified the service, they were able to convince the courts, because it was litigated, that they had the authority to impose net neutrality rules, which governed ISPs and ensured that there was access, unhindered access to the internet. So those were known as the net neutrality rules. It was the open internet order. As I mentioned, there's a lot of disagreement about the best way to regulate broadband or regulate broadband at all. And usually that's reflected in different administrations, historically, it's been a pretty partisan issue. With the change of administration, with the new FCC, a new regulatory classification of what broadband is, the courts then found that, and the repeal of the net neutrality rules, it then became an issue of what authority do the states have to impose net neutrality requirements. Vermont chose to go a very narrow route at the time, and what they did. And there are a number of reasons for that. And again, maybe this is another day conversation to talk about. But it's basically the requirement in Vermont is if you want a government contract, so to provide internet service, if the state's looking to connect a building and public funds are used to pay for that service, you have to agree to comply with net neutrality standards, no blocking, no throttling, et cetera. And the thinking was the state is well within its authority to buy the type of service that it wants. Providers aren't required to compete for those contracts if they don't want to provide net neutrality. Anyway, around that time also, because that was a new requirement, the Attorney General's office was tasked with basically looking at the types of service that providers offer to ensure or confirm that they're actually providing net neutral service. So that's why I wanted to mention the Attorney General's office really, and that's a very long-winded way of talking, a little brief history about net neutrality.
So I would just note, again, correct me if I'm wrong. So the governor had an executive order. We had legislation. We were sued by the entire telecommunications industry. And we prevailed, I believe, in the end. And part of that prevailing was that we have some ability to regulate for consumer protection.
You absolutely do. The question has been how much authority do you have? And I will just I think that in terms of net neutrality, the other perhaps bigger case was in California. In California, they basically adopted the net neutrality rules that the FCC in 2015 had adopted in their state, under a state law, and applied it to all ISPs in California. They were sued. And ultimately, though, that case was dismissed. And that was just in January of last year. So that was a real, what states do will be looked at on a case-by-case basis, but that was certainly kind of one of the furthest reach of state authority, at least in the realm of broadband regulation that I'm aware of.
Representative Logan.
I don't want to get too into the weeds on this one yet, but I'm curious why there would be a benefit to put into state statute and regulations the FCC's standards for net neutrality.
So if I didn't make this clear, I should have said with the change of administration, they repealed the federal net neutrality rules.
Oh, gotcha.
Sorry.
No,
I probably just skipped right over that. No, so they're no longer in existence at the federal level. This presentation is hard. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg because I'm jumping around a lot, but if it's naturally coming up in the conversation, I guess I'm just going to say this. So right now, another change in administration with the Biden administration. There are 5 members on the FCC. Right now, there are 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. In terms of policy, they have different ideas about how best to regulate broadband. Let's put it that way. So President Biden nominated Gigi Sohn, who's a telecom lawyer, a couple years ago. He nominates members. They must be confirmed by the Senate. She was never confirmed last 2 years. She has just recently, this month, been renominated. There is a change, as you know, in the Senate. There's an additional vote. Whatever was going on to hold up that vote, who knows? But there's a potential, at least maybe, that she may be confirmed. Why that's important is because you would then have 3 Democrats on the FCC. That could be an opportunity. I don't know. So much changes in the telecom world, but I think many people speculate that there may be a reversion back to a more, a heavy regulatory approach. And reclassification of what broadband is and the authority of the FCC and the states to regulate. So this is an issue that's playing out that may have pretty significant repercussions for states.
Representative Sebelia.
So just very briefly, Madam Chair, as your friendly independent, I would like to say that it is my opinion that this is a partisan issue. It isn't really that I see problems all around in all parties on this. There's a lot, hundreds of millions of dollars in lobbying, both at the state, at the federal and the state level. So I think there's plenty of issue all around. So I just want to not exclude anyone from the penalty zone.
So I'm not going to cover all of the other kind of offices, but yeah, things. So just so you're like familiar, like you've heard the term like FirstNet. This is a public safety radio access network that's being built in Vermont with federal funds. 911, you're familiar with that as communications for public safety purposes. The state, the various entities are involved with leasing. Are entering into lease agreements for companies to use state land, state buildings, to install broadband along highways, collect fees for that service. Department of Labor has been involved with trying to have programs that develop a skilled workforce to actually do the deployment as it becomes more pressing. So, and there are others, right? There are federal funds for education. The schools have programs. The libraries have digital literacy. It's really every aspect.
Yeah.
Telehealth programs.
I guess what I would like to understand at this level is what is the current status of net neutrality in Vermont today?
So right now there is a law. There's one law right now, and it just applies to state contracts for internet service. So when the state is buying service, acting like a consumer.
I heard that explanation, but so the rest of us could just have, it could be managed. Like,
And we
are.
probably are.
Well, and I think that was part of the hope with the Attorney General's office, kind of monitoring the practices. And that would be a way that people could you can look and see what your service is, and they have to be transparent and do what they say they're going to do. So you can look to see what the performance network management practices are. I don't know if the Attorney General's office actually has a site with information up that looks at all of the providers and the types of practices they have. I don't know the answer to that question. But.
Yeah. Representative Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The federal money that the state handed out for broadband for standing up CUDs, would that be considered a government contract?
That's an excellent question.
That is an excellent question.
So I don't know if technically it's considered a contract for broadband service. If I'm not mistaken, though, in the act that set up the construction grant program, I don't know that it's a requirement or a priority that when the board is reviewing applications, that they favor companies that agree to comply with net neutrality standards. So I think that's how that was addressed there.
Mhm.
So with government contracts, that net neutrality, that's like if A&R is utilizing XYZ internet service provider, that they have to comply with net neutrality standards. That's the government contract. I don't think we went to municipal level, right? It's just government contracts.
I would need to check. I believe all public contracts, but I would need to check. Yep. But for example, the legislature, the access to the internet that we have here, that's a state contract.
This is from 2018, but it is.
So, as I mentioned, I wanted to spend a little more time talking more specifically about the entity that you recently created in 2021 to reach the last mile to get universal connectivity. And Representative Sedalia is a member of the 5-member board. So she can tell you a lot of details about what's been going on with that board. But what I included here is, and I'll read it because it's important, but this is basically cut and paste of the board's mission statement. So again, this is the vehicle. This is the entity through which so much of that federal money has already gone and most likely will continue to go to pay for broadband deployment throughout the state. So let's just read the mission statement. Is the purpose of the board and the fund, the Vermont Community Broadband Fund, to support policies and programs designed to accelerate community efforts that advance the state's goal of achieving universal access to reliable, high quality, affordable, and fixed broadband. The VCBB was created to coordinate, facilitate, support, and accelerate the development and implementation of universal community broadband solutions. So I did underscore universal community broadband solutions. That was a very important aspect to the financing of projects, to the extent that they look at entire communities and ensuring that if there's a proposal for a grant, that it's building out to every unserved location in an area. Distinguishing that from here's money to a cable company to extend the line a little bit further, right? Part of the problem with that and what companies, for-profit companies do, again, because it makes business sense, is they'll cherry pick what are the most lucrative areas. In order to kind of deal with that, the state has said, you need a community, you need to tell us, you need to have a community, and within that area, come up with a plan with making sure everybody in that area has access to broadband. In terms of eligibility for financing, the CUDs are kind of the major player here, the communications union district. So just the briefest of definitions, kind of what is a CUD for those of you who haven't heard about them already. These are municipal organizations that deploy broadband in unserved areas through revenue bonds, loans, and grants. They're basically towns that get together, mostly volunteers that work towards designing a plan for their area. They can subcontract and have a company actually build the network. That's what EC Fiber has done. EC Fiber was kind of the first CUD. They existed before there was such a thing as a CUD. And we'll talk a little bit more about why legally the legal entity of a CUD was created. But EC Fiber, I think they started to talk about getting towns together to build where the private companies weren't building. 2007 and 2008, I believe, was when the first towns voted to join EC Fiber town meeting. So, and there are, I'm not sure now because some of the how many? 10 CUDs in existence today, and you'll hear from the CUDs. There's a great map that can show most of the state falls within a CUD or within a district. There are very few municipalities that don't participate in a CUD. But the state made a decision to really to believe in these local municipal entities to get the job done. In terms of other eligible entities for grants, the other focus was on a municipality that was not part of a CUD, They can also go it on their own if they want. And then the smaller telecom providers, I think it's if they don't do business in more than 5 counties or more than, I can't remember exactly, but the idea was to limit it to some of the smaller broadband providers in the state and give them an opportunity to apply for money to build out their networks. Again, assuming they have a universal plan for a given area. So that requirement is very important. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that some of those small telecom providers may also end up being the subcontractor that operates a CUD
Thank you.
system.
Thank you. And a lot of CUDs are entering into partnerships with providers. Thank you. That's hugely important. So that is a way that some of the larger providers might become involved because they enter into public-private partnerships with a CUD to build out.
I would just add, there are no providers that will build fiber that are excluded from participating. They need to work with a CUD and have a universal service plan. So
Oh, yeah.
it's available for any,
Whether they're
fiber.
willing to do it.
that's right, that work with the communities and have that accountability.
Mm.
I was just curious, so the CUDs, because they're municipal, then the net neutrality issue, does that become a requirement?
If I'm not mistaken, all the CUDs comply with net neutrality.
That's statute.
You know, there's less of an incentive
Well, that's
to create congestion or to throttle service to competitors, right? They're trying to build out the most efficient system, not looking to make profit. They want to be able to pay for continuing maintenance of the system or building out further, but they don't have the profit motive. So as far as I know, I can't imagine any CUD having a service that didn't comply with net neutrality.
Blocking and throttling as part of net, that not being net neutral are profit driven. So, block this or slow this down to make my product more attractive or charge more for this,
kind of tiered services, right? I mean, it's kind of a gray area. Comcast has tiered services. So
I
what's
would
the difference?
love us to go down this funny hole.
So now I'm going to briefly just touch on the federal actors. And I want to do that, one, because of the FCC and its regulatory authority over communications, but also because of the programs that are available. Let's just start going through because I think that will become more apparent. So obviously, I just said the FCC and some of the programs that they offer, as I mentioned, there's a fee on Vermont telephone bills that cover Vermont specific programs. There's also a fee on your bill. It's meant to be a percentage of your interstate communications, not on broadband, it's just telephone. And that money goes into the Federal Universal Service Fund, which pays for various programs. The ones that you most hear about are, there's a subsidy through the Lifeline program. It's also a state Lifeline program for voice service, but there's a federal Lifeline subsidy, about $9.25 a month. And then there's more recently the Affordable Connectivity Program, which is an additional, I think it's $30 a month for lower income households to help make broadband more affordable. There are other programs that they have funded. The big one in recent years, until recently, was a grant program that they offered called the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. It's about $20 billion available nationally. Actually, the department, probably the board too, is keeping track of who were the grant recipients. I think that was in 2019, maybe that program started. It's in phases. But that's important because as the state is looking at who has a funded solution, there may be unserved addresses, but there may be a grant, funded provider that's going to build out in certain areas. So keeping track of all of these funding streams and where the deployment is happening is really important. The FCC also does the National Broadband Map. I'm going to talk about that at the end, but that's a really important issue. Should I talk about it now, Laura? I'm looking at you because I think you have a sense of where this is going, and I'm kind of losing track of, is this following a rational pattern?
It's so much. It's so much. I mean, I think you're there.
So let's talk
I
about,
think this is great.
this is okay. All
You're
right.
doing a great job.
Okay. All right. That's
Very helpful.
okay. So many words.
Don't ask Laura, because she already knows we're.
That's right.
I just
That's right.
hope I'm making sense.
You are totally making
Another approach that would actually help.
your plan.
Okay, so the other two big federal entities in terms of funding that I wanted to mention. First is through the U.S. Department of Commerce, the NTIA, National Telecommunications and Information Administration. That is a federal entity that is charged with administering what's called the BEAD program, which is short for Broadband Equity Access and Deployment. This is a major federal program, over $42 billion. I have a timeline at the end that talks about some of the things that have influenced what the state was able to do way back 2007, 2008, and then more recently. The more recent factors that have impacted what the state can do is the pandemic. There were numerous, as you know, in all areas, numerous federal laws that passed that had a lot of money for states for recovery planning and so on and so forth. Broadband was one of the biggest issues. Obviously, given the nature of the pandemic and lockdown and people needing to access the internet, it really rose to the forefront. So really historic level of funding available through this particular program. What is important to know about the BEAD program? The state, through the board, will be the recipient of those federal dollars, and through the board's grant programs, the money will be distributed to the eligible providers, right? That's really important because other federal programs, some other federal programs, the providers apply to the federal program, or the entity that's administering the program. With respect to the BEAD program, that money will come to the board, and then the board will be able to distribute it based on the priorities that you've set in statute for where the money should go. So just quickly, in terms of the amount that Vermont all states are getting a minimum of $100 million under the BEAD program. The remaining amount of funds will be allocated based on a formula that has to do with how many unserved locations you have in your state. Those locations are supposed to be represented on the new National Broadband Map, which the FCC has had a map for many years, but a real effort to make it accurate, to make sure all locations are on it, and the type of service, which has been usually reported by providers who kind of have an incentive to say, yeah, we can serve that whole area with this level of service, because then those locations are not eligible for federal funding. So there's been a lot of concern that the prior iterations of the National Broadband Map are not accurate. And it's crucial that they're accurate if the state wants to draw down as much money as it's entitled to based on the number of locations that do not currently have service. In terms of the timing, I think the map came out in the fall. Friday, a couple of days from now, is the deadline for individuals or state entities for challenging the information, the accuracy of the information on the map. So you can go to see what service is at your house, what's available. Now you have DSL service. It might say that you have access to 25.3 through a satellite provider.
It said no data available.
Okay.
Maybe that's what's-
A challenge.
Hopefully you'll get some federal dollars. Anyway, so you have things happening at the same time. You have the FCC coming up with a map, and that map is going to be the basis for an additional above $100 million, an additional allocation of funds that all states will see some portion of.
And where do we check our map? How do we check ours?
If you did a Google search, Vermont Challenge broadband map, you'll go to the Department of Public Service website and it'll come up immediately how to challenge. And it's really simple. I've done it.
Just a check is all I mean.
Yeah, no, it's
The board also was publicizing this very actively, and I did early on. I did a front porch forum post to all of the towns in my district, encouraging individuals to go, and I had some similar responses from people who it's easy to find, it's easy to log on, but when they put in their address, no one had ever heard of them.
so, and you're going to hear from Christine on Thursday.
Yeah.
So I know she's been very outspoken and, trying to inform people not only about the challenge process, but about inaccuracies that they've noted already. And I'm trying to remember from an article, but I think there may be like 20,000, I can't remember, a lot of locations that were not even represented on the map. And then concerns about whether some locations that are on the map actually can get the speeds that are covered. So she does have a lot of information, and what she'll also be able to tell you is how much money might be at stake. I think if I'm not mistaken, she said for every location that's inaccurately recorded on the map, it could cost the state $4,000 or $5,000 per location. So it adds up pretty fast.
No question, but you had Laura.
Well, Madam Chair, we may need to, as the beat is coming in, that's something we want to talk to Christine and BQ just about. So speed of implementing those dollars will be important. They may need some language from us to make sure that's appropriated.
Okay.
And that issue also comes up at the other program, and I'm highlighting really the big programs. There are many programs, just to be clear, but these are really the big ones. There is a grant program that's administered at the federal level through NTIA, so not through the board. Money to fund middle mile infrastructure. So again, this is not the transmission lines that go to the houses, but they're the major kind of corridors that might run along connecting different towns or anchor institutions. So you will definitely hear from Christine about this. And I believe the governor has recommended in the Budget Adjustment Act that the state appropriate some money, because the state, and I believe the board is basically spearheading this initiative, to submit a grant to the NTIA for money to build middle mile fiber that would connect all the CUDs and also other, outside of Vermont connections to other states, but primarily have middle mile fiber. That's really important because in order to build a network, it's very expensive. And if you can get the funding to at least connect, the more connections you have, the less expensive it is to build out that last mile, right? The further out the middle mile goes. So I believe the governor has recommended in the Budget Adjustment Act that the state appropriate $30 million because there is a match requirement, 30% match requirement for the funding under that program. So I think they're looking for about $67 million from the federal government. That would be coupled with the $30 million. Am I right on the $30 million? I think, okay.
We won't hold you to it.
Yeah, I don't
Okay.
think we need to get
Somebody apply anything.
to go too far into
Don't see
details
the application yet.
of the numbers.
Just a news story about this yesterday.
It is.
You
It's a-
can
it's a-
Google it and
okay.
find it.
Oh,
Yeah,
I have a question because earlier you said we had great maps in Vermont. Now we have this federal map problem. Apparently they didn't use our great maps.
so,
So why?
Question.
so I don't, so not all states have good maps.
Yeah.
First of all, I think Vermont has been at the forefront. They have historically, as I said, relied on providers to give the information to the FCC. It's Form 477 or something. And that was just deemed good enough. If they had the resources and the time, it would make sense to work with state entities who are on the ground, who know their states, who know the locations, who know where the troubles are. That would make perfect sense. It might just be a resource issue. It might be because a lot of states maybe don't do so, but
We don't know.
just haven't, but that's why the board has been really involved in trying, and the congressional delegation, asking for an extension for the challenge process and then submitting bulk challenges. That's the other thing. Individuals, you can individually check and submit a challenge. The state can submit bulk challenges if it's obvious that there are locations that are just simply not represented. The state can submit that information in bulk.
We might have to pick it up a little bit.
Okay, and we actually are getting very close to the end. So I'm just going to mention the Reconnect program through the United States Department of Agriculture, the Rural Utilities Service. Again, along with the NTIA and the FCC, this is just another entity that has been very actively involved in getting out grants and loans for high-cost areas. The Federal Trade Commission, as it oversees and regulates all issues related to competition, antitrust, just mentioning it because it's an area where there have been a lot of consolidations, and that's often a way the federal government can exert some authority. I'm guessing you don't have the bandwidth to go into too much detail about the Communications Act. I literally have a 20-page presentation that talks about the act. I'm not going to do that here. When we kind of already talked about this already, I will just say, what are the difficulties here? So this is an act from 1934. It was set up, it regulates various communications, broadcast, cable, television, cellular service. There are many communication services that are regulated. In 1934, in terms of telecommunications, it was telephone, right? So a very different model, because significantly, the way the act divides jurisdiction, it says the FCC, you have a broad goal to get, national telecommunications system built. But your primary area of authority is over interstate communications. Well, in the telephone area, that's long distance, it's really clear, right? The states, you have jurisdiction over what's happening intrastate within your state, all the local calling, all the local providers in the state. Well, now you try to put broadband, which is interstate service, really. It has intrastate elements, but that's been the problem all along, is you have a 1934 law that was designed in the area of telecommunications for a very different service and environment. I'm going to fast forward. Doesn't mean it can't work but it does create a lot of ambiguity. And we already talked about, what's central for how broadband can be regulated is how it's classified. Is it a telecommunication service, which might allow for utility style, more like the authority to regulate telephone companies? Or is it an information service, which is not really something that's regulated by the FCC? And anyway, very different opinions on how it should be regulated, and FCC to basically decide. So
But they decided it's it's the light touch.
the prior administration, under a different chair, decided to so it's been reclassified a couple times already. And so the question is, if that fifth member is appointed, will there be yet another reclassification, and how will that impact? So we are almost done, because this timeline, we don't have to go over in detail. And because I kind of already talked about it, but this is a recent history of broadband. You should kind of be aware that of the Vermont Telecommunications Authority, it was the predecessor to the Vermont Community Broadband Board, a different entity. It was set up in 2007. And when I say different, it had authority to issue revenue bonds, which the board doesn't. It had the authority to own and operate networks. It was set up basically to build networks, to lease to providers access to like a cell tower, for example, to bring in revenue and pay for further build out. So it was supposed to be a self-sustaining entity that would be able to help to solve the connectivity problem. You'll remember in 2008 was the Great Recession. So that was a big factor in why the VTA had a hard time getting off the ground and getting access to capital and to use its bonding authority. And also I put in red on this page and on the other page, the federal legislation that has also really impacted what the state. So you'll remember the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, the federal legislation at that time, Vermont got $1 billion, some of which went to broadband, but then there were federal programs that gave out grants. So kind of bypassed the VTA. Remember how I said under the B program, the money's coming to the board, the new board? That was not the case with the VTA. There was this federal influx of money for broadband build out. The VTA could never really get off the ground. They never actually issued any revenue bonds at all. After a period of time, the legislature said, look, you're not doing what you were designed to do. There have been a number of challenges through no fault of your own. We're gonna make you go dormant. We're not gonna get rid of the VTA, because maybe in the future we'll decide that there is the ability to issue revenue bonds and do the work that you did. So it still exists on the books, but it's in a dormant status. The successor in interest became a division within the Department of Public Service that functioned for many years, did some grant programs. I'm going to skip over this a little bit, but then came the pandemic. And so on the second to last page in red, I just wanted to highlight the federal recovery legislation that appropriated significant amounts of money for broadband. During this time, the state, were looking at solutions and already thinking about, we need community solutions. The CUDs are working. They seem to be the vehicle that is most likely to get service to the unserved. So you were already thinking of setting up a mechanism for funding the CUDs, and you had done that piecemeal. And then after ARPA, not that you weren't thinking about this already, but with the American Rescue Plan Act, Vermont was able to spend $150 million or put into a fund $150 million specifically for broadband. And you created the Vermont Community Broadband Board with a very specific purpose, immediately got $150 million. And the next kind of big federal piece of legislation, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, historic level of broadband funding. I think I mentioned $65 billion nationally. Of that money last year, you appropriated an additional $95 million for broadband into the broadband fund. So that's kind of where you are now. You I put on the timeline. It's the end of, it's beginning of 2023. You have until the end of 2024 to get 100 symmetrical service to all locations. And then I also just wanted to, just for your frame of reference, the board does have a sunset date. It's not meant to exist in perpetuity. And so the hope was that you don't have universal service by 2024. You maybe have a funded solution and the board could kind of oversee that, and then mission accomplished 2029. So, emerging issues. I already talked about the map. That's a big issue because of the amount of funding that's at stake. I already talked about the middle mile program, the governor's recommendation, the 248 sunset, the universal service fund. So I'm the FCC commissioner. So we're done.
There's only one I couldn't. All right.
Nice.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
That was-
Lots of information.
That was great.
Without coffee.
That was so much in an hour and 15.
Thank you.
I know. I hope you at least feel conversant and you feel like you know the context, and it'll all become more and more apparent as we move along.
I got it.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hold on one second. Remember, you could, no, you, free to go. Thank you for joining us. I just am going to make one announcement, which is that I'm going to appoint Gabrielle Stebbins as our clerk. We need to have a clerk to count and report our votes.
Is that because she's not here?
Yes, exactly.
For punishment.
That's what you get for not being here, Representative Stebbins. And then I just want to ask if members have any questions or anything before we adjourn and turn off our live stream. Not seeing any.